Rotarians and special guests, it's my privilege to present the program today. It was going to be a very different program until Rotarian and Speaker of the North Carolina House, Harold Brubaker, came to me and said, "Hey, would you like the opportunity to have a special guest?" And I said, "Sure, who is it?" Well, some of you might have known him as the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Most of you would probably know him as the architect and co-author of the Contract with America. Others of you may know him that he was a history professor, and particularly in the area of foreign affairs. And others of you may know that perhaps he represented Georgia in Congress. Well, probably what you didn't know is that he's an avid animal and zoo goer. As a matter of fact, one of the first things he did in his civic duty was he went to the city council of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and said, "Why don't you have a zoo here?" He's also wrote the introduction to the book America's Best Zoos, and he's also somewhat of a dinosaur fan. As a matter of fact, his Secret Service code name is T-Rex. So you're probably thinking, oh, the primary's coming up May 8th, and he's probably come here to talk about that. But that's not why he came to Asheboro and Randolph County. He actually came here so he could see the best zoo and the new dinosaur exhibit. I want you to welcome in just a minute. He's Newt Gingrich is our speaker, the Honorable Newt Gingrich, and he's going to speak for a while, but he would really like for you to ask some questions. And I want you to be sure on your way out to thank Sheriff Maynard Reed for getting him here, literally getting him here. His staff did an excellent job of getting him around the county this morning, and he is here in one piece and everything because of their great expertise. We really appreciate it, the High Sheriff, wherever he is. So please stand and welcome with me the Honorable Newt Gingrich.
I was a Kiwanian as a college teacher at West Georgia College, but as a candidate for Congress, I spoke to many Rotaries. And I learned in that period that Rotary ends at 1 o'clock. And that if your speech doesn't end at 1 o'clock, you'll see an amazing number of backs walking out. So I'm going to be very respectful of that tradition. First of all, Mary Jo, thank you for not just for the introduction, but she took me around the zoo today, and it is a terrific asset, and one which I think will grow in fame, and which will draw more and more tourists here, because it's just a very, very powerful achievement, and we had a great time, and that it is one of my major hobbies. Actually, my two major hobbies are fossils and zoos, and since they have dinosaur exhibit right now, I was able to get both in one morning, so it was a lot of fun. Let me just very briefly tell you where I think we are and why I think this is a fascinating time. We're at the edge of a revolution of capabilities, and almost all of our systems are designed wrong. And so it's as though, to take the example of the zoo we were just at, imagine that you put a really big bunch of bananas on the wrong side of the glass that the chimpanzees are contained by. And so you have all the chimpanzees sitting there going, "We are really hungry, why don't we get those bananas?" But they have no device to get through the glass. That's where we are. We are on the edge of revolutions of capability. I was at Pinsky's shop yesterday, looking at how they build race cars. They use levels of technology that didn't exist 15 years ago. You know, they run their own wind tunnel. They can design composite materials and make a model of something that they want to test in less than 24 hours. And then decide after they made this model whether or not they want to actually machine it out of metal. And it's a revolution in productivity. That's just unbelievable. I was down at Boeing, where they make the 787 Dreamliner. It's at the Charleston Airport. It could actually be anywhere on the planet. They've taken 4 Boeing 747s, and you know, these are the planes that have sort of the hump in the front. They extend the hump all the way to the back, and they call them guppies. They carry pieces of the 787. So the 787 is actually initially manufactured in Italy, Kansas, Korea, and Japan. The 4 components are then flown by Guppy to Charleston, where they assemble it, and they finalize it. It's the first commercial composite aircraft, which means they take a tape about this wide. They have a giant machine, and it wraps the plane in this tape. They then put the entire airplane in an autoclave, which is just like a big oven, and they bake it. And they produce a composite which is stronger than aluminum. So when you fly and I fly in current airplanes, because of the limitations of an aluminum body, we're at about 6,000 feet pressurization. So one of the reasons when you get off airplanes you have a slightly tired feeling is you had less oxygen. This is when it's working. This is without the mask on. With composite, it is so much stronger, they're going to be at 4,000 feet. So you will feel dramatically better getting off the airplane. Because the composites can be shaped differently than aluminum, their windows are dramatically bigger. So the psychological effect is going to be different. I'm not here to sell you on Boeing, but I'm trying to give you a flavor of something. They use, one of the reasons I wanted to go see that was that they use a management system called Lean Six Sigma. And it's essentially a system of really very carefully thinking through what you're doing, measuring it very accurately, and changing your behavior to improve your outcome. We went to one workstation where it currently takes 16 days to do a particular job. They said their goal was to get that job down to 6 days with the same number of people. And I looked at it for a second and I thought, now what if we applied that to the federal government? And what if we said, you know, what we want to do as a goal is to take, say, the Department of Labor and ask, how much could you actually get done if you actually manage it? Now, and this is the example of what I mean about this, and I don't have quite the right language, despite a year and a half of practice. I still don't have quite the right language to explain this. We block ourselves from being competent by the rules and institutions we've inherited. So you have an 1880 civil service system that protects the incompetent. You have cultural habits that block measurement. And you have a refusal to manage well. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. And I was at Penske's operation where they have a real focus because I think it's the most winning team in the history of racing. And they win at all 3 levels. They win at sports car, NASCAR, and they win at Indianapolis-style racing. And you know what they do? They actually think through what they're trying to accomplish. They actually practice it. They actually measure it. They actually replace people who can't do the job. They actually invent new, better ways of doing it. Now, take that model and apply it to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's not that you couldn't do it, it's just we don't. We were talking about one of the great achievements of Rotary, which is we were right at the edge of eradicating polio. I tried to launch, and I'm going to keep working on this. We need an entire project on brain research. Well, that doesn't sound like a political topic to most of you. And I'll guarantee you the Washington Press Corps doesn't sound like a political topic. But if I say to you, a simple question, how many of you know somebody or some family that is dealing with Alzheimer's? All right, how many of you know somebody who's dealing with autism? How about Parkinson's? How about mental health? Guess what all those have in common? They're all about your brain. Now, we're at the edge of a revolution in brain science. But nobody politically understands it. And so they don't apply the resources, they don't reorganize the National Institutes of Health, they don't take on the current bureaucracies. All of whom have very distinguished scientists whose number one goal is to not change because they got to be very distinguished in the system that we inherited. This is normal, it's not that this is abnormal, this is normal human behavior. And so we need a revolution in language and thinking, which will lead to a revolution in politics and government, as a result of which we'll be in a dramatically more powerful, prosperous, and safe country. I'm going to give 2 quick examples, and I'm going to throw open questions. The first is, we're in the middle of a revolution in drilling technology. We've gone, since the year 2000, we've gone from a 7-year supply of natural gas to a 125-year supply. Now, nobody in Washington has thought about this. We've created 63,000 new jobs in Western Pennsylvania alone in the natural gas business. We're in a position to have the lowest cost natural gas of any industrial country in the world. We're going to rebuild our chemical industry in the next 15 years. We're going to have truck stops that have natural gas because it's $1.25 a gallon cheaper than diesel fuel. And big trucking companies are going to retrofit their trucks to use natural gas. And you're going to be in a different world. Turns out, by the way, the same drilling system works for oil. So we've gone in North Dakota from 150 million barrels of reserve to 24 billion barrels of reserve in one state. We're at 3.5% unemployment in North Dakota, and that overstates the problem. The fact is they have 16,000 jobs they can't fill because the 3.5% unemployed don't have the right skills, which is why one of my proposals is have a mandatory training requirement as part of unemployment compensation. People need the money, fine, but they're going to study while they're getting the money, and we're not going to give people 99 weeks for doing nothing. That's a fundamentally different approach. But you need it because you're entering a world where the new jobs aren't going to be doable by people who don't have the new training. So this is a fundamental breakthrough. We have the potential, literally, to be the #1 oil and gas producer in the world, to be energy independent of the Middle East, to never again have an American president bow to a Saudi king, and to be in a position to deal with the Middle East from a totally different standpoint. But that requires coming to grips with how big these breakthroughs are. Last example, the North Carolina story, or at least partially North Carolina. The turn of the last century, people all around the planet were trying to figure out how to fly. And the Smithsonian got a $50,000 grant from the Congress to develop an airplane. 2 brothers in Dayton, Ohio, who were bicycle mechanics, which at that time was a fairly high-end capability, ran a very prosperous, very successful bicycle shop, were fascinated by flight. They studied birds, they built their own wind tunnel, and they went to the U.S. Weather Service and said, what is the best place in America had to have continuous updraft, because they wanted wind to come up and help lift the airplane. Turns out the best place in America is Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, because the wind comes in off the Atlantic and comes up the hill. So for 5 years, every summer, they get on a train, because that was the only way to go from Dayton to Kitty Hawk at that time. They get on a train, and they go to Kitty Hawk for the summer. And they always take a lot of extra wood. Now, would any of you like to guess why they're taking a lot of extra wood? They're going to break something. Because the Wright brothers understand something really, really important. They don't know how to fly. You'll see in a minute why this is such a big deal. Over the course of Cliff and I recently visited Orville Wright's home in Dayton. And again, this is a good example. If you go and check, there's actually, I think it's Politico, but some political reporter writes a snide comment about why is Gingrich wasting his time going to Orville Wright's home? Because they have no clue about learning. And the idea that maybe learning would be good. And having political leaders who actually learn something would be interesting. So anyway, I'm talking to the curator at the house, and he said, they kept very detailed records. They tried to fly 500 times. You'd get up in the morning, fix some coffee, launch the plane. It would crash. They would talk, what went wrong, what should we fix, how should we modify it? They'd fix it, they'd try again. Now they're doing all this on their own dime. They did not apply for a government grant, they did not wait around, they did not fill out forms. They're just down there as a hobby. They spent about $500, which that's then your money, so it's a lot more than it sounds like today. They spent $500 in 5 summers with 500 failures. Finally, on December 17th, 1903, they get up in the morning, they fail 4 times. The 5th time, they fly for 53 seconds. Slightly less than the distance of the wingspan of a 747. At a speed slow enough that one brother ran along next to the plane to make sure that it wouldn't tip over and cartwheel and kill his brother. Now, they'd only flown for 53 seconds, but they had figured it out. By 1907, they fly around the island of Manhattan, and 1,500,000 people see an airplane for the first time. That's how fast it evolved. Now, while they're doing this, the Smithsonian has $50,000. And the Smithsonian is probably as smart a center of knowledge as there was in the United States in that period. And so they reach out to Germany to get really first-rate metallurgists. Now, the Wright brothers consciously built a really weak, light engine. In fact, they patented a whole series of things that the auto companies began using 25 years later. Because they wanted an engine that was so light so they could build a really light airplane. The Smithsonian gets really great German metallurgy and builds a really powerful engine, which is really heavy, which means you have to have a really heavy airplane. And the Smithsonian, because it's prestigious, doesn't want to go all the way to Kitty Hawk, which is inconvenient, because it's in Washington. So they have to figure out how are we going to solve the problem of getting wind under the wings. And they invent something which we still use in nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. They invent a catapult. And because they're really smart, because they've really studied all this, and because they have all these theories, they've misunderstood the number one ground rule the Wright brothers understood. The Smithsonian thinks they know how to fly. So they take their plane down to the Potomac River, and they invite the press to come. And they put it on a catapult, they start the engine up, goes straight down the boat, and straight into the river. Now, there's a double problem. If you hit water instead of land, the plane gets torn up more, not less. And because it's a river with a current, it gets torn up even more. And when it finally goes to the bottom, which it will, because there's a big heavy engine, when you try to take it up from the bottom, you're going to tear it up even more. So by the time they get this soggy mess back on land, they have no idea what didn't work. Now, they're busy being prestigious scientists who are now really embarrassed because the newspapers all made fun of them. And when the Wright brothers fly, the Smithsonian reacts so negatively that for 37 years the Wright brothers will not give them their airplane. Because the scientists at Smithsonian going, you're bicycle mechanics. You're not allowed to invent something we were paid to invent. Now, I'm telling this story just to wrap up. I want to draw some lessons here. And it'll tell you a lot about what's sick about the culture of this country. First of all, 2 guys who didn't have a PhD in aerodynamics, didn't have a grant from the Department of Aviation, weren't authorized by anybody, on their own, went out and invented the airplane at no cost to the taxpayer. Can you imagine the congressional hearing? If at failure 495, they'd shown up. Can you imagine the ridicule? But it was a different era. It was an era of optimism. It was an era that thought we can do things. It was an era that believed that the future would be exciting and dynamic and different. It's the same period where Henry Ford's inventing the mass-produced car. It's the same period where Edison is inventing the phonograph record, the motion picture, the electric light. It's a time when people thought things could get better, dramatically better. Our inability and unwillingness to think about the possibilities sitting around us cripple us. It is the greatest weakness in our political system today. And the power of our interest groups at protecting the past. You know, if the stagecoach operators had been unionized, and the Stagecoach Association had hired enough lobbyists, they would have blocked the airplane. Because, of course, it's going to eliminate the stagecoach. Actually, the railroad did first. I'll close with this example. Ronald Reagan used to tell us a great story. 1932, he is a broadcaster on WHO radio in Des Moines. And there's an earthquake in Los Angeles. In 1932, it was illegal to broadcast radio news because the newspapers had gotten a bill through the Congress that said instantaneous transmission was an unfair competitive advantage. And yet Reagan knew that the people of Iowa wanted to know, because many Iowans had gone to California. So he and the engineer worked out a deal. This was back when they literally piped in live band music from New York. Every time the Associated Press would send out another wire report, they would accidentally turn down the music. And the engineer would say, "Hey, Ronnie, I just got another report from AP." And he said, "Oh, did you? What did AP say?" And he would then read to Reagan what AP said. And then they'd turn the music back up. He said it was the most amazing evening of his life because at 2 a.m, they get a wire from Los Angeles that says, "The building is now collapsing. AP Los Angeles is going off the air." Now, I cite that example because we've become a country that ignores the Wright brothers, ignores Edison, ignores Henry Ford, and is surrounded by the kind of mindset in our bureaucracies, in our lobbyists, in our politicians, and in our news media that understates the enormous breakthroughs that are available for young people. And I think if we can just go back to believing in the fixing things that don't work and replacing them with things that do work, 10 years from now, this will be an amazingly more dynamic country. And I think that's the hope for this country. So let me toss it up for questions for people.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes, sir.
Our campaign finance process seems so confusing and so complex and crazy, really. If you could reform campaign finance, what would you do?
I'd have a very simple law that said any American can give any amount of after-tax money to any candidate as long as they report it on the internet that night. And I just cut out all the super PACs, all the intermediaries, all the lawyers, all the regulations. And I'd say, I don't mind competing with free speech. And I think you'd immediately overnight, every candidate would have access to dramatically more money at dramatically less effort. You wouldn't have all of this convoluted stuff. And frankly, the candidates would never approve the kind of negative stuff that the super PACs do. And so you'd have a cleaner, healthier system overnight. I mean, all the campaign reform effort of the last 30 years has been a disaster. It's made it more complicated, more expensive, more difficult. It's very anti-middle class. It means if you're rich, you have huge advantages now. You know, if you're the mayor of New York, you write a check for millions and millions of dollars. I mean, basically Bloomberg bought re-election. Just the amount of money he spent per vote it's a plutocracy. It's not a democracy. And so we're going to have really talk seriously among ourselves about getting the system back to work. And ironically, that means you want to make it easier for middle-class candidates to get money, not harder. Because then you'll have real competition. That's what I do. I'm sorry, yes, sir.
What would you do to the educational system to change the mindset of the general populace that we have now, as far as trying to come up with fresh ideas, look at things differently, etc.?
Well, I think charter schools are a useful step in the right direction. The more you can return, I have a couple big thoughts. The more you can return decision-making to the parent, the child, and the teacher, and get it away from, I'm not only against the Federal Department of Education, I'm very skeptical of state departments of education. I think this whole idea that bureaucrats who aren't in the room, don't deal with the student, have abstract ideas. I'm also very much against schools of education, because I think their model of learning is just wrong. Learning is a missionary vocation. Getting kids, I don't care what you teach. Give me an example. States adopt these curriculums. They say you have to study X, okay? I don't care what a kid reads as long as they read. I mean, if every young boy read NASCAR, and every young girl, I'm not trying to define things sexually, but every young girl decided to read ballet. I have a 12-year-old granddaughter who's into ballet right now. Fine, they're reading. If something big happens somewhere in the world, the Icelandic volcano goes off, and that day the class talks about volcanoes. Terrific. Instead, we say, well, we can't talk about that today because that's not in the curriculum right now. What we're going to talk about today is something you don't know about, I don't care about, and it's totally boring, but this is mine. We have bureaucratized the education system. The other thing we've done is we've taken discipline out of it. I mean, the morning we went from, if your teacher punishes you when you get home, I'm punishing you, to how dare you punish my son who's perfect. The day we tolerated that, we began to destroy education. And so I think you've got to go back to the basics. And I think the other thing I'd say is you want it to be 24/7, pulled for by learning. I am for every child at every level having computers. It's a little complicated with very young kids because of the danger of pedophiles. But essentially the principle's right. And think about how you learn. And I mean, very few people learn by going somewhere for 50 minutes at the convenience of somebody, and then doing it for 9 months. People learn intensely, they learn quickly, they piece it together, they have mentors. So we ought to think about how we restructure learning to fit how we really do it, as opposed to a 19th century industrial model. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker, Judge Rob Wilkins. Sir, lots of times we hear a lot about our rights, that we need to protect our rights with these rights over here. We don't hear a whole lot of talk about the responsibilities that are the flip side of that coin. What are the three governmental laws or policies that you would change or eliminate to stop rewarding irresponsible or illegal behavior?
That's a good one. Let me say first, just a couple of things. I say this recognizing that we have a very senior member of the legislature here. You would, I believe, improve the country substantially if you required every child to encounter the Declaration of Independence every year. And so I would write that in, and I would say, we're going to deal with it, and whether you did it, picked a particular day or however you did it, just the act of explaining what did they mean when they said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Just getting through that section begins to change who you are. I would say also that every child ought to learn about Captain John Smith, who in 1607, in the first English-speaking permanent colony, is approached by the aristocrats, and I've always loved this because it's the opposite of liberalism. They're approached by aristocrats who say, hey, we paid our way here, therefore you can't make us work. And Smith says, you're right. But this is a new world, we have limited resources, so I can't make you work. And he then basically paraphrases Paul in Corinthians. It says, however, if you don't work, you won't eat. Well, they had a meeting. They came back and they said, this work thing. So I start with a couple of simple ideas. We need to my younger daughter and I wrote a book called 5 Principles for a Successful Life. Dream big, work hard, learn every day, enjoy life, be true to yourself. I always tell students right after dream big comes work hard. Our kids don't work hard enough. We don't have a work ethic in our system. The very fact that we give away 99 weeks of money for doing nothing should tell you how sick the culture is right now. And so I think you've got to really think about how do you reassert the work ethic. I would also tell you, I personally believe that we should seriously look at drug testing for any receipt of government money. I think the drug culture in this country is so much more dangerous than we think it is. It ruins so many more lives than we think it does. And it is tragic what we are tolerating. And it's a matter of what you tolerate. You know, Singapore has zero drug dealing. They're also extraordinarily ruthless about it. We are financing a civil war in Mexico. That's the American paid war. And then so there's no innocent buying of cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin. This stuff all has a direct consequence of criminal behavior. So that would be an example of something I would consider very seriously. Yes, sir.
What do you think would going to be the effect on our healthcare system whenever the Supreme Court strikes down Obamacare, assuming that they do?
Well, I think the odds are very high they're going to strike down the mandate. And the odds are not quite as high, but still pretty high, they're going to strike down the whole bill, because in their determination to impose the bill on us, when they lost Kennedy's seat in the special election, they couldn't fix it. And so they decided that they would pass a badly written bill without going to conference, because they couldn't get it through the conference. They couldn't get it back through the Senate with Kennedy going. The result is they did not put in a very specific paragraph called severability. Now, so if the court really enforces the law, if they find that the mandate's unconstitutional, they're almost bound to find the whole bill's unconstitutional.
And then what happens?
Chaos.
Chaos.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, these guys have for 3 years been driving the bureaucracy to drive them. Go talk to your local hospital. I mean, talk to doctors. I mean, talk to the State Department of Health. This will be a nightmare. I mean, it's a bigger nightmare if we allow it to survive. But they have done everything they could to rush this stuff in to try to establish a regulatory environment. And the only I personally believe that it has to be taken out totally, root and branch, totally. And it's like kudzu. You can't take out part of it because it'll regrow. But that'll be a mess, and this goes back to my point about opportunity. If we followed the right policies in health, just as if we followed the right policies in education, we'd have an extraordinary explosion of opportunity. But frankly, private insurance bureaucracies aren't dramatically better than government insurance bureaucracies. The whole model's wrong. Any third-party payment model is inherently wrong, because it means that the person getting the good doesn't pay for it, the person delivering the good knows the person getting the good isn't grateful, and the person who's paying for it doesn't get anything, so they resent both the person who's getting the good and the person who's getting the pay. And so you build a system of mistrust. I mean, this goes back to your earlier point. We should say to everybody, guess who the number one person responsible for your health is? It's you. You know, and if you insist on drinking 2 gallons of whiskey a day, being 75 pounds overweight, not exercising, you have a fairly high opportunity of being sick. And it's not because you're a victim. And this will be culturally a really interesting discussion, but it's one we absolutely have to have.
But they allow their Congress. So how do we change Congress?
Well, first of all, since Cobal's in the primary, you better hope he's right. Howard is an old family friend. When my daughter and my son-in-law lived in Greensboro, my son-in-law was the tennis coach at UNC, and my daughter owned the Carolina Coffee Company on State Street. And my son-in-law would play tennis regularly with Howard, so he's an old family friend, and I wish him well in the primary. And I would say, by the way, the election of 2006 and 2010 proved that they may not always like their congressman either. I mean, those were both decisive repudiations. Those were pretty big defeats for both parties. In my judgment, by the way, earned by both parties. The Republicans deserved to get beat in 06, and the Democrats deserved to get beat in 10. We wrote a book called Valley Forge, a novel about Washington. When you get to Valley Forge, the supplies will be there. There were no supplies. He arrives at Valley Forge with 14,000 men. There are 2 axes. The Congress doesn't pay the troops. The Congress doesn't provide for food. I mean, you go through this, people in the Congress are plotting to replace him. I mean, it is a case study in why people hate the Congress. And as we're writing, I kept sort of laughing about the fact that here we're writing this accurate historical explanation of the problems of self-government. And the genius of Washington and what he would say to all of us is, yeah, It is a really messy, hard, difficult system, and occasionally you've got to fire a lot of people to try to get its attention. It also beats any other system in history. Remember, Washington is approached by his officers at the end of the war, who say, the Congress has failed, the Congress isn't paying our salaries, the Congress won't keep its word, you're the head of the Army, why don't you take over? Albany, New York, Springfield, Illinois, are disasters. They're not democracies anymore. The interest groups own them. Doesn't matter who wins the election. This is a real crisis of self-government. This is the biggest crisis of self-government since 1860. And it's been going on now for a while, and it's going to keep going on until we break through. And most of the breakthrough will be intellectual, not political. It'll be figuring out the future, what'll work, how we get it to work, and then how we get the American people to impose it. Politicians will never voluntarily go through the level of change we need. But if they can't go home without having to do it, they will fear for their offices more than they will fear the lobbyists. And until the American people know what they want and are prepared to insist on it, it will stay a mess under either party. And that's where we are. Thank you all very, very much.
Let's see who's the lucky one. He'll take 2 more questions.
I apologize, there's an old vaudeville rule about it. Leave them asking for more, not asking for less. Both of these guys overruled me, so back there and then you. That's it. Yes, sir.
Speaker, you know that the tax increase schedule will go in place here next year. Congress is. What's your gut feeling about anything being done about that before you take office in January?
No, I think that it'll be done in either in a special session after the election, or it'll be done in the first 2 months of next year, is my guess. I mean, this is, again, if you watch what's happening in Greece, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and now Denmark, now Holland, we need to understand the entire industrial world is decaying. And if we add a gigantic tax increase in this economy, we are truly just utterly irrational. But it may take having to get a new, particularly on the Senate side, it may take having to have an election in order to be able to get anything through the Senate that's at all doable. You get to be the last question.
Speaker, we saw you 40 years ago, bro, at Archdale, the little airport at Gar Airport up there. You remember that? The question that's not my question.
It wasn't 40 years ago.
No, it might have been 50, but we've got an important election coming up in 2012, and I think all agree with that. Would you handicap Scott Walker's deal with the recall in Wisconsin and what you see with Congressional, Senate, House, and the presidential picture quickly for us?
I'll do it quickly, but I consciously stay away from politics because it's a Rotary Club. So I won't tell you how I personally would vote and make an impassioned appeal. But intellectually, in the Fox tradition of being fair and balanced. I think it is probable that Scott Walker will win, partially because the Democrats can't get anybody, they're messed up in terms of who they're trying to run against him. But the unions are coming in very heavily. I mean, the unions understand this is life and death. If Walker wins this fight, you will see a continued reform of unions across the country in a way that will be, they are terrified of, okay? In fact, I did my newsletter this week on an Employee Rights Act, which has been put in, which begins to move further down the road towards union reform. I think the Republicans will gain seats in the House. I mean, I think North Carolina is a good example. We're probably going to pick up 3 or 4 seats here. I think when you look around the country at large, I mean, part of the problem the Democrats have is that the places they do really well are losing people. And the places we do really well are gaining people. And part of that's a migration to lower taxes. And you're in upstate New York, and you go, let me get this straight. I can move to Florida and pay no income tax, or I can stay here and pay X amount. And in midwinter, you suddenly decide it ain't that much fun shoveling snow, and you go to Florida. And so there's been this steady migration that has, I think, the other side of that is Republicans have to break through with Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. I mean, and African Americans. They cannot fail to come head on with how are you going to reach out and how are you going to offer a better future for every American, or they ultimately won't be competitive. So that's the balance there. I think the Republicans will probably win the Senate this year. Question is, will they win it by a big enough margin to be able to govern, or just have nominal control? And I think the presidential election is going to be very, very interesting and very difficult. My gut instinct, because I lived through 1980, is that it's very hard for Obama to get reelected. Just because you look at, and I'm not saying this is a partisan, I'm just saying, you look at unemployment numbers, you look at the price of gasoline, you look at the size of the deficit, and you ask yourself the following simple question. If you had to bet in the next 5 months, are there more good things that are going to be happening, or are there more bad things that are going to be happening? Well, you look around the world, there is a lot of stuff going on. I mean, Spain is a basket case. 22% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, and still unable to get anything under control. So I just think that the odds are fairly high that what will happen in October is that people will say no. That's what happened to Carter. What happened to Carter was, in the end, people said no. I'm not sure about Reagan, but I'm sure about you. And I think that's what will happen, is my guess. Thank you all very, very much.
For those of you who would like to interact with him, he would like to hang out just for a little bit longer. He'll be around, so feel free to direct his questions to him then. But as far as Rotary meeting is concerned, I'd like to end on a note. Dwight Eisenhower said, "Leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it." On that note, we are adjourned.